Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the catastrophic chain of events behind the world's worst industrial disaster. It's a story about how every single safeguard can fail one by one when they're needed most. Let's get into it. So, let's go back to the night of December 3rd, 1984, in Bhopal, India. Imagine you're Suman Day, a control room operator at the Union Carbide pesticide plant. And you hear that sound, a huge hissing. That was the sound that came right before an absolute catastrophe. And by the time the sun came up the next morning, this was the cost. Over 3,000 people. Gone. In just a few hours. So you have to ask, right? How does something like this even happen? I mean, how does a whole city become a death trap overnight? This wasn't some makeshift operation. It was a modern factory with multiple safety systems. So what went so horribly wrong? Well, it happened incredibly fast. It started as just a minor leak, something that might seem almost routine, but within minutes, the pressure gauge for one of the main chemical tanks literally shot off the scale. A runaway reaction had started and nothing could stop it. Before anyone really knew what was going on, a toxic cloud was just silently drifting over the sleeping city. So what was this gas? It's a chemical called methyl isocyanate, or MIC. And this stuff is just unbelievably dangerous. All it takes is contact with water, and it starts to boil violently, turning into this thick, heavy, deadly gas. And what it does to the human body, it's horrifying. When you breathe it in, it basically causes your lungs to fill up with your own fluids. You literally drown from the inside out. So, in the aftermath, you've got this nightmare on your hands. And for investigators, there were two huge questions. First, what on earth caused this chemical to go critical? And second, and just as important, how did it ever get out? And they found the trigger. It was water. But not just a little drip. We're talking about 500 kilograms of water. That's over 1,000 pounds. Now, how does that get into a supposedly sealed, high-tech chemical tank? This is the one thing that is never supposed to happen. The whole system is designed to prevent exactly that. So, what happened? Well, it wasn't one single failure. It was a whole chain of them, a perfect storm of small mistakes and shortcuts. It all started with something totally normal. Workers were just washing out some clogged pipes. But a jumper line, basically a pipe used as a shortcut, was in place, connecting the water lines directly to the MIC tank area. The next link in the chain, a critical safety seal that should have blocked that path, it just wasn't there. And the final, fatal blow, the valve that was supposed to be the last line of defense, was broken, and had been for weeks. The water had a direct, unobstructed path right into the tank. And get this, while the investigation was just starting, the danger wasn't even over. There were another 35 tons of this stuff still sitting in the plant, a ticking time bomb. The only way to make it safe was to restart the factory, the very same broken factory that had just killed thousands. Can you imagine the terror for the people who survived? They actually called it Operation Faith, which seems pretty fitting since that's about all they had to go on. Okay, so we know how the water got in, but that's only half the story, isn't it? Because this plant had all these modern, expensive safety systems. So the really disturbing question is, why did none of them work when they were needed most? Right away, two very different stories started to emerge. Union Carbide, the American parent company, immediately pointed the finger at sabotage. They claimed a single angry worker did this on purpose. But when independent investigators started digging, they found something else entirely. Not one single act, but a long, slow pattern of negligence, all driven by cutting costs. Let's just break it down. There were three main safety systems that should have stopped this leak. First, the vent gas scrubber, which is supposed to neutralize the toxic gas. It was turned off to save money. Second, the flare tower, meant to burn off any gas that gets past the scrubber. It was broken because a corroded pipe hadn't been replaced. And finally, the water cannons, the absolute last resort. They were too small. They couldn't even reach the escaping gas. 3 layers of safety, and on that night, every single one of them was useless. And when you look closer, it's not hard to see why. The plant was losing money, so management slashed the budget. They got rid of the maintenance supervisor role, they didn't bother fixing broken gauges. That critical pipe for the flare tower, it would have been a 2-hour fix. They didn't do it. And people inside the company were raising the alarm, saying the systems were inadequate, but their warnings were just ignored. And it really all came down to money. By 1984, Union Carbide had cut the Bhopal plant's annual budget by the equivalent of about $1.25 million. A series of small decisions, a pipe not replaced here, a position eliminated there, that all added up to one massive catastrophic failure. So that's how it happened. But the story of Bhopal doesn't end when the gas clears. Not even close. The shadow that night cast is incredibly long, and people are still living under it today. The human cost is just staggering, almost impossible to comprehend. You have the thousands who died right away. But then, the Indian government estimates another 15,000 have died since from related illnesses. More than 500,000 people were left with chronic health problems. And to add insult to injury, the factory site was just abandoned, left to rust and continue leaking poison into the local groundwater. So what was the final price for all this suffering? Well, in 1989, Union Carbide paid this much in a settlement, $470 million. In exchange for that single payment, the corporation received total immunity from any future criminal charges. But what does that number actually mean for the victims? When you divide it up, it amounted to, on average, about this much per person, $600. For a lifetime of sickness, for losing your family, that was the value placed on their suffering. It took until 2010, 26 years later, for a conviction. 8 former Indian plant managers were found guilty of death by negligence. And this was their fine, about $2,000. No one from the American parent company ever faced a trial. And through it all, despite mountains of evidence pointing to systemic failure, faulty equipment, and a culture that put profits before safety, the company's official story has never changed. The story of Bhopal is a brutal reminder of a question that is just as relevant today as it was then. When a company decides to put a price tag on safety, it forces all of us to ask, who is the one that ultimately pays that price?